Hello YouTube and welcome back to part 5 of this series on how to use this CRP-5. Now, the plan of this video is ultimately to show you, using the CRP-5, how to calculate the true airspeed. But I felt that it was a bit naive to assume that you even know what I mean by true airspeed. So what I'd like to do is to spend maybe 5 minutes just explaining, first of all, what the true airspeed is, so you know exactly what it is that you're trying to calculate to start with. So, first of all, we need to talk about two other types of airspeed. We need to talk about indicated airspeed, the IAS, the calibrated airspeed, the CAS, and that will allow us to then work out the true airspeed, also known as the TAS. So, ordinarily, this is how you can work out the TAS for a given aircraft at a given altitude on a given day with a given temperature at a given power setting. So this is a page from the PA28181, which is the Piper Archer, and this is out of the POH, the Pilot Operating Handbook. And if you want to calculate your true airspeed, you simply come in down here. You've got your outside air temperature at the bottom. You've got Celsius and Fahrenheit. You work your way up to the desired pressure altitude at the level that you're going to be cruising at, and you simply follow it across to your given percentage power setting. Are you going to fly 55%, 65% or 75%? And then once you've gone up, across and down, it then gives you what your true airspeed is. And this is what I used to use quite a lot when I did my flying. As long as you know your outside air temperature and your pressure altitude, and this is effectively exactly what we're going to do on the CRP-5. We're going to find out outside air temperature and our pressure altitude, and simply figure out what the true airspeed is based upon the calibrated airspeed that we have to start with. So before we get into the ins and outs of how to do this, let me briefly explain what indicated airspeed is, what calibrated airspeed is, and then we can work out what this true airspeed is that we see so much about. So first things first, indicated airspeed. Indicated airspeed is a way of measuring dynamic pressure. The object you see on the screen is called a pitot tube, and this pitot tube is basically a small cylindrical tube into which air gets fed into as you fly through the air. And inside that pitot tube will be some form of device which has been calibrated to convert the pressure of the air going into it into an airspeed. Obviously, the faster you go, the more air is going into that tube, and as a result, the pressure will be higher, and that registers as a higher airspeed. It's called an indicated airspeed because it's a very raw measurement. The air gets forced into the pitot tube and is directly converted into an airspeed without any corrections taking place. Now the equation for dynamic pressure, as you can see on the bottom right hand side of the screen, is a half rho v squared. The half rho is half of the air density. Density is measured in kilograms per cubic meter, although in aviation terms we generally measure it in grams per cubic meter. And the v squared is your velocity squared, and that velocity actually is the true airspeed. Notice on the diagram as well, just point out that here we've got some burn marks on the pitot tube. This is obviously because the pitot tubes have to be electrically heated to prevent icing. So here we have a diagram of a simple basic airspeed indicator from a single engine aircraft or a twin engine aircraft. And the important thing to note is this comment at the bottom here, which says the airspeed indicator shows an indication of the air resistance being experienced by the aircraft and how close it is to any aerodynamic limits. The reason that the airspeed indicator gives us an indicated airspeed is because that indicated airspeed, as I said a minute ago, shows you what the physical force of the air is over the aircraft. It shows you what the dynamic pressure is going into the pitot tube, which is then registered as an airspeed. But that also shows you, or tells you, what the aerodynamic forces are going over the aircraft. And that's very, very important, because we want to know what the aircraft is doing and what airspeed the aircraft is at relative to its aerodynamic and its structural limits. So at the bottom of this green arc you have things like your stalling speeds, VSO, VS1, and then up here we've got some structural speeds, VNE, velocity never exceed, the maximum operating speed VNO, and we've also got the white arc there, which is a structural speed based on the structural strength of the flaps, for example. Beyond that, we have something called the calibrated airspeed. Now, on the screen in front of you, you can see a picture of an EasyJet 737, and you can see that there is a blue box which is circled, if you will, at the front of the aircraft, and this is the area called the air data collection area, and this is the portion of the aircraft that measures all the airspeed data for this particular type of aircraft. This is a picture that I took at Bournemouth Flying Club a couple of years ago of a Frontier A320, and again you can see I've put this red box around the front of it just to show you. We have the captain's static vent there, and we have a couple of pitot tubes down here, and we've also got, you can just about see the first officer's static port on the other side, static vent there, and there's a backup one down here. I think this is the angle of attack indicator, and there's another device there. Now notice the position of these are all towards the front of the aeroplane. The reason that they're at the front of the aeroplane is so that they are unimpeded from the airflow. They're not suffering from any forms of turbulence due to the structure of the aircraft or the engines. So again, going back to this picture, you can see that the pitot tubes are up there. I think that might be a static vent there. Either way, they're at the front of the aircraft, so they're fairly not going to be affected by any form of turbulence. So you get a nice clean measurement. Now, this is a picture of a Spitfire, which I took from work a couple of years ago during the Bournemouth Air Show. And I've put a box around the pitot tube on a Spitfire, and notice how this pitot tube is out here on the wingtip. Now the reason that the pitot tube on a Spitfire is out on the wingtip and not at the front of the aircraft is obviously because on a Spitfire you've got a great big propeller in front of you, and if you put the pitot tube at the front of the aeroplane like you did like you would on this type of aircraft, then obviously the problems you're going to have is that the airspeed measured is going to be highly affected, incredibly distorted measurement based on the airflow from the propeller. So on any aircraft that you fly that has a front nose mounted propeller, something like a PA-28 or a Cessna, you'll notice that the pitot tube is always going to be near the wingtip to make sure that the air entering it is as unaffected as possible. Now, the calibrated airspeed is very simply the indicated airspeed corrected for instrument error. There are always going to be some form of errors in the design of an instrument. No instrument's ever perfect. And the position error. And that has to be taken into account because, again, there is no ideal place really to put a pitot tube on an aircraft. And the airspeed measurement is going to be affected by the attitude of the aircraft, which will affect the airflow. You have to take into account that when an aircraft is climbing or descending or turning left and turning right or yawing, you're going to affect the way in which the airflow enters the pitot tube. So you have to be able to calculate the changes between the raw data coming into it and then take into account the airflow caused by the attitude and position of the aircraft. You also have to take into account the fact that, as we saw in one of the previous images, the pitot tube of the vast majority of aircraft is heated to ensure that no ice builds upon the pitot head. The problem with heating air is that you obviously lower the density of the air, and if you lower the density, then you're going to affect the measurement and the amount of air pressure being detected. So the position, the temperature and the instrument error all have to be taken into account. And you can see at the bottom of the screen there that we can simply write that the indicated airspeed is, that the indicated airspeed corrected for what we call pressure error corrections will give you the calibrated airspeed. So the calibrated airspeed is simply the indicated airspeed corrected for instrument error and position error, which collectively are called pressure error. So now we know what indicated airspeed is and calibrated airspeed is. Let's look at the one we're interested in, which is the true airspeed. The true airspeed is very simply the speed of the aircraft relative to the surrounding atmosphere. And it can be easily seen from this equation, which is, again, if you remember the equation from one of the previous slides, which showed that indicated airspeed, we called indicated airspeed dynamic pressure, or PD. Pressure dynamic is what that means. So dynamic pressure, or the indicated airspeed, is a half rho v squared. Now you can see that if I'm flying at an indicated airspeed of 100 knots and I climb to a higher altitude, notice that my air density is going to decrease and decrease and decrease as I go higher and higher in the air. Now, in order to maintain a constant indicated airspeed with an ever decreasing density of air, I have to physically fly faster through a given volume of air in order to maintain the same dynamic pressure. So just to make it clear, as I'm flying at a given fixed indicated airspeed, let's call it 100 knots, if I now fly to a higher altitude, my density decreases. As the density decreases, there's less air going over the airframe. There's less air going into the pitot tubes. So as a result, I have to fly faster through a given volume of air or a given parcel of air to make sure that the aircraft maintains its aerodynamic airspeed, okay, or its indicated airspeed. So the dynamic pressure is constant over the whole airframe. Now you can see from this diagram that, let's just ignore the EAS. The EAS is what we call the equivalent airspeed. We're going to ignore that for now because this is to do with compressibility corrections, which we haven't talked about. We'll talk about that in a later video. So you can see here we've got a graph showing altitude on the left and we've got speed at the bottom. So altitude's on the y-axis and speed's on the x-axis. So speed increases to the right and it decreases to the left, and the altitude is increasing as we go up the page. So if I'm flying at a constant calibrated airspeed, again, let's call this 100 knots. So I'm at this speed here at 100 knots and I'm at sea level. And my calibrated airspeed and my true airspeed are going to be the same at sea level. If I now climb to a higher altitude while trying to maintain a constant calibrated airspeed, which for all intents and purposes is almost the same as the indicated airspeed, there's not much in it. Notice that in order to maintain a constant calibrated airspeed, my true airspeed has to get faster and faster. I have to physically fly faster through the air because the air's getting thinner. So there's less air going over the airframe, less air going over the wings, less air going into the pitot tube. So I have to fly faster to maintain my calibrated airspeed. So we can say that true airspeed can be found by simply applying the corrections. We say that the indicated airspeed, which is the raw data, the physical amount of air entering the pitot tube, when corrected for pressure error, which we said was due to the instrument error and the position of the pitot tube, gives you calibrated airspeed. So indicated, corrected for position and pressure and instrument, gives you calibrated. Calibrated, when corrected for compressibility, we haven't discussed that yet, we will give you equivalent airspeed, and equivalent airspeed corrected for density error due to a change in altitude and temperature will give you your true airspeed. And you can remember this by this excuse me, this mnemonic. We say iced tea, pretty cool drink. And you can remember it by simply drawing it out as so, and remembering that your indicated airspeed, when corrected for pressure error, will give you your calibrated airspeed, which when corrected for compressibility will give you your equivalent airspeed, which when corrected for density will give you your true airspeed. Okay? Now that we've done that, if we go to our trusty CRP-5, so how do you calculate the true airspeed on the CRP-5? Well, very simply, to prove the point that I was just making, that the true airspeed and the equivalent airspeed are the same at sea level. Well, that was a bit of an error on my part. They're not always the same at sea level. You see, the airspeed indicator on an aeroplane is calibrated to only one specific configuration and one specific atmospheric setup, and that is what we call ISA, the International Standard Atmosphere. And the International Standard Atmosphere is a theoretical global average, and it says that the International Standard Atmosphere conditions are at sea level, at mean sea level, we have a temperature of plus 15 degrees Celsius, and we have a density of 1.225 kilograms per cubic meter, or 1,225 grams per cubic meter, and we have an air pressure of 1013.25 hectopascals, or if you live in America, 29.92 inches of mercury. Now, if we normalize the CRP-5, that is to say that we set everything up so that all of the 10s line up with each other, the 11s and the 12s and the 13s and 14s are all lined up nicely together, you can see that if we look in the airspeed window down here, Let's look under pressure altitude. Pressure altitude is 0 feet, so this is standard sea level, 0 foot pressure altitude. Notice what the temperature is. The temperature is plus 15. There's 0. This is minus 40 to the right and plus 50 to the left. So if we count left from 0, this is the temperature on the outer scale. We can see we've got 5, 10 and 15 degrees. And also if we look on this altitude window here, the same thing. We've got our air temperature in the middle window and we've got pressure altitude on the bottom. And if we look at our pressure altitude, a 0 foot pressure altitude, which is sea level, look at the temperature. It's 0, plus 5, plus 10, plus 15. And notice also that our density altitude is also 0. So the CRP-5 is set up in this normalized state to give us an international standard atmosphere. Now, if we look at the CRP-5 in a bit more detail, we can see that on the inside scale we've got something called a RAS. Now a RAS, for all intents and purposes, is the same as a CAS. I think it means rectified airspeed, and it's an old terminology which has now been replaced by the term calibrated airspeed. So your CRP-5 might actually have the terms RAS and CAS on it next to each other. The point is, you've got RAS and CAS on the inner scale, and we've clearly got TAS on the outer scale. So it's a very simple calculation to do. What we're going to do is, first of all, I'm going to set the CRP-5 up to be normalized, and I'm going to look at a scenario whereby, let's say we're flying at 130 knots at sea level. So we're at sea level, 0 foot pressure altitude, at 15 degrees Celsius, okay? And if I'm flying at a calibrated airspeed of 130 knots, which again, for all intents and purposes, is pretty much the same as the indicated airspeed. There's only a small number of knots difference between them. You can see that in an international standard atmosphere, that my calibrated airspeed is the same as my true airspeed. Now, what happens as I fly higher? Remember we looked at that diagram and we saw that in order to maintain a constant calibrated airspeed as you fly higher in the air, then your true airspeed has to increase. Well, we can prove that. So let's now pick a scenario whereby we're flying at 10,000 feet. Now, you should also be aware that there is something called a temperature lapse rate, and it tells us in ideal conditions what the rate of temperature decrease is as a function of altitude. And the ICAO paperwork states that the average atmosphere, the temperature will decrease at a rate of 2 degrees per 1,000 feet. Okay, so if it's 15 degrees at the surface, then it's going to be 13 degrees at 1,000 feet. It's going to be 11 degrees at 2,000 feet. It's going to be 9 degrees at 3,000 feet. So for every 1,000 feet that you climb, the temperature decreases by 2 degrees. So if we're at 10,000 feet, the temperature is going to be 20 degrees colder than it is at the surface. So if I start out at the surface and the temperature is 15 degrees, by the time I get to 10,000 feet, I've lost 20 degrees, and 15 minus 20 is minus 5. So if I see my 10 down here, you can see this on the pressure altitude, which is represented by this center white arc. At 10,000 feet, if I set up my temperature to minus 5, remember, minus numbers are to the right, positive numbers are to the left. There's 0, so this number here is minus 5. And I'm going to set that minus 5 up next to my 10,000 feet. Now have a look at our 130 knots again. Notice now that in order to fly at 130 knots indicated or calibrated, I have to fly the true airspeed of 150 knots because I'm now flying in an atmosphere where the air is much, much thinner, so I have to physically fly faster in order to maintain the same dynamic pressure across the airframe, which is very important because I need to know where I am relative to my structural and aerodynamic limits. So, I hope you learned something today. It's that simple. If you want to figure out how to calculate your true airspeed on the CRP-5, find your airspeed window. You've got a nice box under here that even tells you. It says there to compute your true airspeed from Mach number or your rectified airspeed. We'll deal with the Mach number in a separate video, but look for your airspeed window and simply line up the temperature with your pressure altitude and then read off your true airspeed on the outer scale next to your calibrated airspeed on the inner scale. It's that simple. And again, if you can't remember your CRP-5 doesn't even tell you. TAS is on the outer scale, rectified or calibrated is on the inner scale. Thank you very much. Any questions? You know what to do. Thank you.